Welcome to Diabetes Day by Day, the American Diabetes Association's official podcast for people with diabetes. The goal of our podcast is to empower our listeners with knowledge. Knowledge is power, and today we're going to be focusing on disaster preparedness. Disasters can occur in many forms. Today we're going to focus on environmental disasters. The thing about disasters is, one, they will happen, and two, they're generally out of our control. Disasters include things like hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, wildfires, winter storms, extended power outages, earthquakes, you name it. Even now, cyber attacks. Any of those things can interrupt the chain of access for medicines and supplies from producers to pharmacies to the medicines we have in our own homes. Disasters aren't in our control. What is in our control, though, is the decision about whether or not we choose to prepare for that eventuality and how we choose to prepare. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm your host, Dr. Neil Skolnik, professor of family and community medicine at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University and associate director of the Family Medicine Residency program at Jefferson Health, Abington. And joining me today to discuss this topic is someone who is truly an expert in the field, Dr. Sylvia Kehlenbrink. Dr. Kehlenbrink is an endocrinologist and is the director of global endocrinology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She is a part-time assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and the founder and director of the Diabetes and Humanitarian Crises program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. In 2019, she organized the inaugural symposium on diabetes and humanitarian crises at Harvard University, convening more than 100 global health leaders to identify barriers and priorities for improving diabetes care in the humanitarian settings. The resulting Boston Declaration, published in the Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology Journal, laid the foundation for the International Alliance for Diabetes in Action, the IADA, which is a global alliance dedicated to improving diabetes care in humanitarian crises, where she serves as executive director. That is my shortened way of saying that we are really fortunate to have Sylvia joining us. And Sylvia, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on ADA's Diabetes Day by Day podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Can you share with us how you got interested in preparedness for humanitarian disasters?
Yes, absolutely. So for me, it really began during my residency when I was in New York. We spent a month providing medical care at a small district hospital in Uganda, near the border to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there was a small refugee camp right there, and I befriended some of the refugees, some of whom I'm still in touch with today. And the people there and the stories there impacted me deeply. And I recall at the time we were able to treat most or the major infectious diseases relatively well. So someone walked in with a fever or a cough. We were able to treat with antibiotics, antiretrovirals, for tuberculosis, and people generally got better and did well. But we did not have diabetes supplies routinely. We did not have insulin, diagnostics on a regular basis. And we had a few young adults or children, I would say early teenagers, that came in that were clearly in diabetic ketoacidosis and DKA. But we just did not have the means with which to treat them or properly diagnose them even. And unfortunately, none of them survived. And that's a memory that, is just seared into my brain, and just thinking about how is this possible that we don't have access to insulin in these settings. And so from there, I started talking to different humanitarian organizations that were in that area. And one thing led to the next. And, humanitarian agencies typically, historically, have not provided chronic disease care, including diabetes care. But they were very interested in doing this and saw the great need. And so from there, we organized that initial meeting here in Boston in 2019 that you mentioned, bringing together these leaders in global and humanitarian health to talk about the issues and how do we even begin to address this as a global community. And yeah, that's essentially what I've been doing ever since.
Well, Sylvia, I'm listening, and I just have to say, when medicine is at its best, it derives from the empathy we have for each other, and your description of that is moving. When we think about humanitarian crises, I've always thought about things that are acute and time limited, a sudden surge in need as a crisis. And what you're describing, I guess, fits a crisis too, a chronic crisis. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. There are the acute phase of a crisis, generally considered those first 6 months. The hurricane hits, the earthquake happens, the war breaks out, right, in this case, which I know we're not talking about conflict today, but most crises are protracted nowadays. The vast majority globally are protracted, lasting years or sometimes even decades. So you have to be prepared for both eventualities, both phases of the crisis.
Yeah, and that's interesting, and I imagine we'll get into that a little bit later. There's what's immediate and then the ripple effect downstream. Now, we're talking today about unexpected disasters, large events. Why should people with diabetes think differently about preparedness for those large, sudden events than someone who doesn't have diabetes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for anyone preparing for a disaster, be it hurricane season or how do we prepare? So most people will think about supplying food and water and batteries and flashlights and those types of things. But if you also have diabetes, you also need to be thinking about how will I be able to continue managing my diabetes in that crisis where my normal routine is completely disrupted, right? Where pharmacies are going to be closed, roads will be blocked. And not only how do I continue my medication and diagnostic supply, but also how do I then manage my high blood sugars, which are likely going to result from all the stress, potentially, how am I going to manage nutrition and food and all of those factors that influence someone's blood sugars. So juggling all these different factors, aside from just even my home is now flooded kind of a question. So there's that added layer that people with diabetes need to think about.
Now that makes a lot of sense. And all of us need to have a preparation plan for disasters that might happen. But in many ways, our cushion of ability to maintain, the term we use in medicine, right, is homeostasis, to maintain things as normal, isn't as fragile as it is when you're dependent upon medicines, on certain aspects of routine, the right diet, as it is as is the case when you have diabetes. Now, you've seen and thought a lot about disasters. Are there any aspects, before we talk about the details of how to prepare, that came as a surprise to you?
I will say, from my lens, again, I work predominantly globally. And so what I have found so fascinating is how each and every disaster or situation is so different and unique. There are no two situations that are exactly the same. All the while, ultimately, the needs of people living with diabetes, especially in those initial moments, I would argue, are relatively universal. You want to make sure you maintain access to your medications, your diagnostics, and your care. I think that's universal, but the way that the crisis evolves is different from place to place. What's the local context? What's the country? What's the underlying health system? Who's providing the diabetes care in those settings? Is insulin even available in these countries at baseline? So what's going on before the crisis really impacts the response to a crisis, especially because on a global scale, we live in the United States, and so thankfully do by and large have access to pharmacies and medications. It's in the community, but that is not the case globally, and so each situation is extremely unique, and I think that's what always strikes me as the challenge.
But how should people begin to think about preparing?
So, I would say, especially in those early days after a crisis, so, right after the hurricane hits, you don't know what your surroundings are going to look like. You don't know the roads that will be accessible, or where you'll be able to get help in the immediate moment. So the importance of being able to manage your diabetes independently is absolutely critical in those moments, because there's potentially not going to be a doctor available within potentially even days, right? We don't know. So you being able to know the person living with diabetes, you know yourself the best. What insulins are you using? How do I make sure I have backup supplies at home that are easy to access if I have to run out of the house? Having a little grab bag of medications, the diagnostics you need, maybe glucose tabs, just a few things that you can run with if you needed to in an acute emergency, and having copies of your medications and your healthcare providers. I think that's incredibly important. Other thing I will say that I've seen be incredibly important for really prompt care and help are communities. I think the diabetes community itself has shown over and over again in different countries, no matter kind of where I've seen disasters occur, the WhatsApp groups of communities living with diabetes, or different via Instagram, or I don't know, TikTok, or different groups have their different communities, so that because for humanitarian responder to know where you are, or the disaster, the responder, how will they know where you're living and where you are? And social media and texting, you can make yourself known, I'm here, I need this, and the community itself really rallies and supports each other. It's been incredible to witness and see how they really save lives like that.
Now, I want to break down things a little bit. We're now talking about the short period of time right after a disaster hits, and how to prepare ahead of time for that. And that preparation ahead of time, you mentioned backup supplies. How many days or weeks of medicine should you have a backup? Because many of us, under ordinary circumstance, we refill our meds when they're ready to be refilled. A few days before we run out of meds, we go to the pharmacy. They have our medication available. And, if it's toward the end of that every 1 or 3 month refill period, we might only have 3 or 4 days of medicine left. Any thoughts how to approach that? And
Right. Yeah, no, it's that could definitely be tricky. Ideally, we say if you can have 2 weeks of medication at home that will last you 2 weeks. Definitely 1 week. Ideally 2 weeks. That's what you want to aim for. And this, I think, is probably the most critical for people with type 1 diabetes. For them, this is 100% life-saving imperative. And I will argue that probably, I don't know, at least I do, most endocrinologists will prescribe a small buffer of insulin. Like, sometimes if people are sick and they need more insulin than they're normal, so
Yeah.
having a little buffer, I do feel like a lot of my colleagues, we will prescribe that so that people have backup.
That's interesting. And I will say to our listeners, because that isn't always done, this is part of that empowerment thing we talk about, that you can take this knowledge and go to the clinician taking care of you and explain why you would like that buffer. That's such an important point. Copies of meds. Often we will print out our meds on the computer, or we get a printed out copy when we go see the doctor. Should they be laminated? I'm just thinking of, again, a hurricane where there's flooding and that piece of paper just becomes unreadable.
Absolutely. I think laminating it is a great idea. I also think now everyone has a smartphone, and the first thing you'll probably grab when you're running out of the house is going to be your smartphone. Having it on your phone. And I think that's one of the benefits, at least here in Boston. We have, I use Epic. I'm sure, different hospitals use different medical records, and there are patient portals. So if you have access to the internet, you could probably open up your chart and show it to someone to say, this is the meds I'm on. But having it like photograph, just take a picture of your med list or have it in a little note on your phone, I think even that would probably go a long way,
No, that's those are important points. And having a place to go, I imagine, is important. Again, that hurricane's coming through, and we often have decisions to make, and part of it depends on our social circle, right, and our connections, that we might know someone inland. We can drive ahead of time if we know that there's a hurricane, for instance, coming in, or usually most communities have designated areas for emergencies, but having some sense of where those places are. So that's in the immediate few days. Then what happens? I imagine there's a predictable sequence. The storm comes in, havoc hits, you've got to leave your home, get to somewhere safe, need medicines with you ahead of time. I often think there's a Latin phrase I heard a number of years ago, amant victoria curum, and that translates to victory loves preparation.
That's a good one.
And it's I actually have that inscribed on one of my pens, because I think it comes up in all sorts of different parts of our life. But, have that plan. You have your meds. You've got on your phone the list of meds, who your doctors are. You have a place to go. So now you're good for that first 3-4 days. Then what tends to happen?
Well, it really depends on the circumstance, right? I think in the U.S., by and large, natural disasters, they happen. And you're temporarily displaced, say, you're temporarily living in a shelter or somewhere until the flooding has subsided or the wildfires have subsided and you're able to go back home. Well, the ADA and the Diabetes Disaster Response Coalition works with the ADA. They have all kinds of phone numbers and resources on their website and checklists that I think are really actually very thoughtful and great to print out. So if you can't access a pharmacy or you can't access insulin, there are phone numbers there that you can call. So I would also take a picture of those resources or put them in your pocket just in case you are displaced for more than a couple of days and it ends up being weeks.
Yeah, no, that's such an important point. And, it's so interesting because whenever you and I are used to talking about averages with all sorts of things, that's how we look at response to medicines. And of course, what we worry about ourselves is how we as an individual do with either a medicine or with a disaster. And clearly wildfires, hurricanes, some people get back into their house within 2-3 days. Other people have homes that are devastated, and it can be months till they get back in. And what they have is what they were able to take with them. So that idea of having that secondary backup plan, you've made it through the first few days. Now, what are those phone numbers for how I find help, how I find meds moving forward become that much more essential. I guess also batteries, certainly for one's CGM, if you're on an insulin pump, making sure you have a backup form of.
I think to your point about technology, this is something I was going to mention later, but I think it fits here, is that technology is obviously fantastic, right, in so many ways, and it makes our lives easier, and the goal is to make diabetes management easier. But I think one of the things is over-reliance on technology in these situations. So, for example, you can't access so you like used up your CGM, the backup you had, or the infusion site, insertion is no longer available, and you can't use your pump anymore. Knowing what your pump settings were and staying familiar with how to inject yourself and check your blood sugar with a finger prick. I've seen that a few times, people coming in and then they have to relearn how to do that if they've been using pumps for many, many years. So that I think is critical, because I'm going to venture to guess that most emergency responders probably won't have that technology available. They'll have insulin, maybe different insulin than you're used to. Maybe not even in a pen. Sometimes it's a syringe in a vial. So you just have to be able to feel comfortable to some extent switching between these two modalities.
Boy, I hadn't thought about that, and that's so important. The importance of flexibility, right? There's great strength in regimens and doing the same thing every day, but that which is a strength in one circumstance isn't always in another. And here, having the ability to be flexible and do what it takes, what the situation demands. Are there any common mistakes or important mistakes that people should think about in order to know what to avoid?
Right. Well, I think, the kind of over-reliance potentially on technology, that's one. I think another kind of, I don't know that this is a misconception necessarily, but sometimes like if your power goes out after something occurs and the refrigerator dies and, is no longer keeping the insulin cool, people, often I've seen them throw away whole bunches of insulin because the fridge was out for an hour or two. And, I think the data is pretty strong that, you don't need to throw it away immediately if you don't have any other options. If you don't have any other insulin and the pharmacies are all closed, insulin will probably be fine. So I think that's another thing people have a lot of fear around is the insulin. On the flip side, what not to do potentially is to put the insulin next to ice packs and freeze it. That will definitely damage the insulin. So you don't want to freeze it. If it's a little warm for a day or two, it'll probably be fine. And then, I think those are some of the main things that I've kind of come across.
That's a really good point. And GLP-1 injectables as well know how long they can be kept out of refrigeration.
Exactly.
We're nearing the end of our podcast. If our listeners were to remember only 3 things from our discussion, Sylvia, what would you want them to be?
I think one is just the importance of, knowing your diabetes. Knowledge is power. Knowing your type of insulin, your doses, your pump settings. So having that information at hand. I think having a grab pack, a to-go emergency pack that you can run with in case you needed to, having that ready and kind of checking it every 6 months to a year, just making sure it's still up to date and not expired and having that available. Um, and the third thing is, knowing who to call, your community. Communities are very strong and very resilient and can really, they come together when, disasters happen. I think it really shows the beauty of humankind and the coming together. So I think those are the things, and not to be scared, I think is what I would also say, is that you can prepare and it can give you peace of mind just in case your normal routine is disrupted. There are things that one can do to prepare and get through the storm.
I do think the key is preparation. Dr. Sylvia Kehlenbrink, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us as well, of course, as always. And I think if there's one theme, if there's one lesson that resounds very loud to me in our discussion, it's that importance of preparation. I personally love that term, amat victor crum, victory loves preparation. And I'll say, as we were talking today, I noticed that there was this wonderful back and forth. And what I'm going to suggest to our listeners is that part of preparation is talking with someone else and say, here's what I've done, anything I missed. Because I know that when I think things through as careful as I am, and I talk to my wife, there are always things that she thinks of that I haven't, and vice versa, of course. And so have that plan, write that plan down so you can then add to it, talk to someone that knows you, that you trust, to go over the plan, and don't end there. Actually get that packed together, know where your meds are. As Sylvia said, as you said, have the information on your phone. And as long as you make the effort to prepare, you'll figure it out. Something to remember, something that has often been attributed to Ben Franklin, which is by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. For the American Diabetes Association, I'm Dr. Neil Skolnik. Thanks for listening.